Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be watching. Welcome back. We've got all sorts of tales to tell today about the ascension of King Lobengula to the throne. And I'm going to be wrapping up with some of the other stories that we've told in the past to show how they all integrated into this particular one. One, of course, being Rider Haggard and King Solomon's mines, and Alan Quatermains were appearing from every corner of the Western world who'd all read this story of daring do and were convinced that the only bit of Africa that really they hadn't seen much of in those days was that land between the rivers. Had to be there. Okay, so that's where we're going to start. But just a thought, if you're watching on YouTube, if you'd like to see these regularly and just be in the loop when they're coming up, click register and hopefully click like, and then that ensures that you will get some sort of notification that says, okay, another one's there if you want to watch. So off we go. Let's look at it. On the front, I put up a photograph. It was a composite photograph. And on the left-hand side, you see a great big gathering together. And that was actually King Lobengula's inauguration. Dominant there is the king himself, standing at the gate of his capital, inspecting the Imbezu Regiment, which was probably the crack regiment of all the Matebele regiments. And on the right-hand side, you have a picture of him sitting just before he was inaugurated, dressed in Western clothes. I looked at that, I thought, oh, that is bizarre. Why on earth would he be interested in dressing in Western clothes? Well, having been brought up by Sarah Liebenberg, who'd been given to King Mzilikazi as a slave, he was used to white company. And he had three very good friends that he used to go hunting with. He loved horse riding. I didn't know that either. So I guess that probably just for horse riding, it was probably easier to wear Western clothes and just gallop off with his mates. Now those mates, there was one called Induna Sam. Now there's some doubt as to whether or not Induna Sam might even have been Sarah Liebenberg's brother, because her brother was also given to King Mzilikazi, and he became a very important Induna in one of the major regiments. But he did something which the king didn't approve of, and he was not heard of again. So, and when he was probably killed because he had done something he shouldn't have done, and when that happened, of course, then he's not related again in oral history. So it's hard to find these things out. But anyway, there was Induna Sam, and there was also a great adventurer, hunter, and story writer, and that was, of course, Courtney Salou. And he was a great naturalist too, so he was fascinated by all the animals and everything that Jandu could tell him from all his years of being in the Matopus with the Mlemo, who was the spiritual head of the Matebele people, who understood all of these things. And Jandu had had this inculcated into him from a very young boy. And the third one, who popped in and out of their lives, was Robert Baden-Powell. Now, he was there in a military capacity, but he used to go hunting with them as well. And I think several sources suggested that he actually learnt most of his bushcraft, his identification of plants, his ability to live in the bush from Jandu, from King Lobengula to be. So what a legacy King Lobengula left to the whole global world of sporting, coming through a brilliant man in the shape of Baden-Powell, who was fascinated by what Jandu or Lobengula had to tell him, and was filled with all these wonderful things that he wanted to go off and teach people around the world how to become more self-sufficient. So lovely little stories and all of that. But the day was coming when they were hunting in Mazoe. They were actually having real trouble with the Portuguese. The Portuguese kept sneaking over the border, over the eastern districts there, and insisting that no, this was their territory. And so, fortunately for the British, Lobengula preferred the British, and I suppose his friends were all British. Anyway, So they were all trying to get rid of the pesky Portuguese who kept threatening them. So they were in Mazoe Valley hunting, chasing the Portuguese, and through came the news Mzilikazi had died. Well, he was devastated. He never wanted to be king. So he spent the next 2 years trying to convince everybody that he was just the son of a pesky Swazi princess whom nobody liked, and the real son, well, the eldest son, was Nkuluman. Now, bearing in mind that Mzilikazi probably had other sons, but they would have been born before he was inaugurated as king. So therefore it is only after the inauguration of a king, a child born after that can become the next king. There were two. There was Nkuluman and there was Jandu. Nkuluman disappeared after the Ntabazinduna incident, and nobody really knew where he was. But as I mentioned a couple of weeks back, there is a grave just near the Botswana border, and that seems pretty likely that he actually just didn't want to go back there, and he stayed. So what was it that these two young men recognized? Perhaps it was that their way of life was changing, and whoever was going to be in that role was going to be in a very, very difficult position. So what happened when that occurred to poor Jandu? One of his friends was a missionary called Thomas. Nice easy name to remember. Thomas Morgan Thomas, who was at that time running Inyati Mission. And he has written well about his time there. Again, all this reporting back to the London Missionary Society, which was very useful in terms of getting the flavour of what was going on. So he wrote about this. As for Lobengula, when first informed by Nkumbata that he was the real heir to the throne, he became so alarmed and convinced of the existence of a plot against his life that he escaped from his own town and, riding about 50 miles, took refuge at our house. Why was he afraid that his life was in danger? Because Chief Mbigo, whose wife was the sister of Nkuluman, he was determined to find Nkuluman. He didn't want Jandu anywhere in the picture. So he was concerned. At first I thought, well, it doesn't seem very likely, but yeah, it was very likely. 3 days after, Thomas goes on, after I prevailed upon him to return home, he would do so only on condition that I went with him to ascertain from the chiefs exactly what the situation was. Difficult for him, very difficult for him. Nothing he wanted. He hated the idea of that. So now he had to go through a period of all this trial and tribulation as to which was going to become king. And of course he was pestered all the time. People wanting this, people wanting that, some favouring that, some favouring that. Eventually, after about 2 years, all the chiefs fell behind Chief Nkumbata, and they went to Jandu with all the royal cattle and said, "You are to be our next king." I imagine, just from reading all of these bits and pieces, that he was probably a bit devastated by that stage. Anyway, nothing venture. It was now on. They'd waited for 2 years to get this resolved. And they'd had all sorts of waiting times before that, which meant that at the Inaugural there was nobody to throw the spear, which meant that there was nobody that could go out and start another raid, and the cattle were getting few. There was a restlessness in the camp. So they were only too keen to get on with the inauguration. Well, wow, what a ceremony that was. The custom of the Matebele, upon the occasion of the inauguration of their king, is to fetch him from his own town and lead him in triumph to the capital. On the 22nd of January in 1870, the warriors appeared at Uchocho, which is actually known today as Cholocho, Uchocho, which is Lobengula's town. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning when great clouds of dust were observed ascending to the skies, and the approach of a mighty army soon became known to the people of the town. A very great lamentation was set up by the prince's wives and children and other relatives who were present, and this continued non-stop until the evening. The army, rapidly advancing, was soon near the town and passing at a quick march on the east side, and in a short time they stood in battle array on the north, about half a mile distant. So again, that discipline of the Matebele, which is, you just see it every time. It's amazing. They were extraordinary people at that time. Still are. When thus situated, it presented a figure of a half moon or semicircular shape and extended about a mile from east to west. 7,000, 8,000 people? Many long speeches and traditional songs about the one who was hiding, but was now strong enough to eat up all his enemies, ensued. And you had, as you often do in those cases, two people speaking about it. So from the king's perspective, they performed military maneuvers and betrayals of great bravery and rhythmic stamping and loud conversations, and these were interrupted. So one side, Uchwabalala, he was from the king's side of things. He shouted out what the prince wanted for the country and the people, guaranteed that raids would continue and subjugation of the tribes would continue. He gave undertakings about the royal cattle and insisted on the need for the people's absolute obedience and loyalty to Lobengula as king. On the other side, Uptaza repeated and acclaimed every detail with great theatrics and pomp and ceremony on behalf of the people. The warriors roared their approval and had agreement on every point. Then, again as happened so often in Matebele, any type of process, there was a moment of silence, very dramatic. Uptaza turned slowly to make a formal request to the family and to the people of the village of Chocho to deliver their new king. With a great shout, they agreed. And at that point, Prince Jandu came galloping out straight towards the massed lines of regiments. At the last moment, he wheeled his horse round to look back and raised his hand in a dramatic farewell to his family as the mounted escort fell in beside him. That must have been a new thing for any sort of inauguration of the Matebele people, a mounted escort to march him back to his capital. With a flourish, they galloped off at great speed, and huge shouts and excitement followed. You can imagine that. Wow. Anyway, they had prepared all the oxen, 16 perfectly pure black royal oxen, for 10 days of feasting, because that's what it took when you inaugurated a new king. Led now by their prince, the soldiers in high glee covered the country for a mile in every direction, dancing and singing the whole way from Uchocho to Ntlantlandlela, which was the name of Mzilikazi's capital at the Magaliesberg. Before entering the town, a consultation was held, during which Lobengula, with his lifeguard, stood under a tree, nearly surrounded by the dancing and singing crowds. And there is a picture on the front there of him dressed in those Western clothes. Amazing. So literally from riding into town with his guard of honour. An ox was presented to him and he was invited to enter the city, which he did by the north gate, still in his Western clothes. Fascinating. But it was about to change. The Matebeles who greeted him, listen to this for how they looked. They had a couple of spears with a centre supporting rod, clothed at the point with the tail of a jackal in their left hands, a long staff in the right hand, an ample cape of black ostrich feathers or a bandeau of yellow otter skin, and a blue crane feather fixed on front of it on his head. His arms and legs were ornamented with brass bangles, threaded beads, or tufts of white oxtails, a tippet of the finest umpila skin, which we would know better, I think, as dossies, covered his shoulders and chest. Isn't it fascinating how the human being, wherever they are, love ritual and ceremony and processing? Bulky kilts of strips of various wild animals were fastened round his waist and hung loosely round his hips. To a looker-on from the adjacent hillock, the view was a fine one, and as Thomas Morgan Thomas was one of only 3 white people allowed to attend that inauguration, it must have been a very privileged one too. The motley, moving, mighty mass of people, swelling their songs of praise to their illustrious ancestors and former kings, like the chanting of a great cathedral, while within their feet, as they lifted them in turns from the ground, the time was kept. Whilst thus formed, dressed, and engaged, the whole multitude moved from one side to the other, like the trees of a forest in a strong breeze. One veteran soldier after another leapt out of the ranks, holding his shield as an imagined foe by rattling it in his face, and at the same time vaunting his expertness in battle, evading armed assailants, leaping over fallen ones, struggling to stand as if hard pushed, plunging his spear into one after another, until the whole number of those imagined as killed by him were counted. All that wonderful sort of dramatic theatrics that would have accompanied that whole thing. Wonderful that Thomas was there to record it, because these things get so easily lost. There have been a lot of criticism about the missionaries too. There's always criticism about everybody. But they did this priceless recording, and in all the research I did, where I found there were vested interests from the perspective of every single person who wrote what they said they did, was very hard to arrive at the truth. At least with the missionaries, I had a pretty good feeling that they were only answerable to God. They didn't have to impress him. So they wouldn't tell Mum about how wonderful they'd been, etc., etc. While Lobengula, by this stage the king, he went into a house where he was to stay away from his family, no wife, no children, no family, one sister, Nsengens, or Nina as she got to be known. She became a very powerful member of his household, and she looked after him for the whole of that month. For the first 24 hours he didn't emerge at all, until he had been recognized as a priest, presumably by the Mlimo. So all his years of working with the Mlimo paid off at that particular point. And there he was, for 3 months, separation from wives, children, and family. And they built a new capital around him. And all the rites and purifications of the king took place, while huge feastings went out for the next 10 days, and ritual killing of all the oxen. It's a little bit bloody to read about all that, but quite amazing what they did do. So, there we have it. And what was in store for Lobengula? Well, I have a feeling he had a pretty good idea of what was in store, and it was not going to be easy. Rider Haggard had done absolutely nobody a favour in that part of the world with his King Solomon's mines, and as I said, Alan Quatermains was springing up from all over the world, determined to find this filthy lucre that was lurking under the soil. They were all going to be pretty bitterly disappointed, but that's the tale for next week. Lovely that you were with me, and I hope you got a bit of an inclination, a bit of a feeling of how interesting those times were. And old Thomas Morgan Thomas must have been fascinated by the whole thing, I would think. I'll be back same time next week. And don't forget to register if you're watching YouTube, and I will try and let you know on all the other social media when the next one is up. And please do send me questions. On my website, if you double-click the header, then there's a whole question and answer session at the back that you can send questions to me. And that's been the greatest joy of doing these podcasts, is saying, wow, fantastic, a little bit of knowledge there, a little bit of something there. Somebody comes up, my grandfather did, my father did. Wow, it's been a rich, rich time for me. And thank you all. I thoroughly enjoy it. So next week, we look at some of the problems facing King Lobengula.